Have you ever wondered what really happens when we dug in places that should remain untouched? Have you ever felt the weight of the ground as if he were waiting for you, keeping secrets buried for centuries? The story you are about to hear is about a man who dared to open the wrong grave and paid a terrible price for that. Before you continue, subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because what you will see will shiver you to the soul. Now get ready for what comes next. I have never been to believe in spectre stories. I spent my whole life surrounded by death, digging graves and burying body without ever seeing anything ultra-ternious. But if there is one thing I learned in the years I worked in Ravenwood's holy field, is that the soil has memories. The soaked rain soil murmurs secrets, and the buried bones keep memories that should not be remembered. The most shift was the most silent, but not the quieter was in one of these dawn, when the mist was crawling between the tombs and the wind whistled between the graves. I heard for the first time a so-called low, dragged as a whisper coming under the ground. At first, I thought it was my mind preaching a suggestion of loneliness, but then the call called me by name. And that's how I started my name for over 20 years. I was the only janitor of the field. Ravenwood, one of those old places forgotten by the time when the moss-covered tombs carry names that no one else remembers, was not glamorous, but paid the bills. But I never had to deal with living people, and it pleased me the Saint-Saëns was around the city of Salem far enough so that no one cared with what happened inside during the day. Dawn at Dawn was a forgotten place. The lighting was scarce, only old posts, with yellow lamps flashing, creating grotesque shadows between the rows of tombs, the smell of wet soil and rotted smell, even in the dry days. I liked the silence, liked to walk between the tombs and imagine the lives of the people buried there, but there were also things that I avoided. The old mausoleum, in the old mausoleum. End of the ground where the walls were covered with inscriptions that no one could translate. Never. Looked at certain graves that seemed to sink faster than they should, and never wondered about the coffins we sometimes found empty. But at dawn in particular, something was different. When I heard the noise of the problem, I was the only janitor on duty at dawn. The noise of paddles was still a rhythmic sound, opening a hole in the damp ground. My first instinct was to think it was some vandal or some thief of tombs, although I did not know who in the right conscience would choose a cold and luscious dawn to do something like this. I took my flashlight dried and followed the noise. The rows of tombs seemed even more shadowy in that dawn. The freshly touched the ground. Seeing beyond a few meters, my heart was beating strongly on my chest, and my mind was struggling between logic and irrational fear. Perhaps it was just an animal, perhaps my imagination. But then I saw there was an individual standing next to an open grave. He wore an identical uniform to mine, faded the same dirty boot, his face, but he was hidden by the hood. He was holding a padded Rith Solo to the side, and I shouted, "What the hell you are making?" No answer. I approached slowly, trying to firm the flashlight, but the light went along with my hand was when I realized the strangest. There was no footprints around the grave. The floor around was untouched, as if he simply appeared there. My stomach. If the individual stopped staying there immediately, holding the silence so he saw me. Back my breath waging the throat. There was no face to the skin where the eyes should be, my mouth. All was smooth as melted wax, like a mannequin, something without soulless identity. And then he said, "You already dug your own grave?" Jonas blinked and went out. The pitch took over my breath and a sharp cold. Metallic body with trembling hands, but nothing happened. So I heard the sound of something crawling. First was a low rustle like fingers scratching wood, then a snap like a bone. Leaving in half my mind shouted for me to run, but my legs were paralyzed. Everything in me said something was climbing that open grave. It has already been his own grave. Jonas the so-called whispered again, but this time did not come from the faceless individual. Came under me. The ground under my feet treated something. Pulled my leg tightly, and I was thrown on the floor. I felt the grains of cold soil enter the collar of my uniform. Oh, and it was there that I saw that was not a corpse, was not human, was a pale and deformed, with 2 long arms and thin fingers that nailed the edge of the coffin that was burying the face. Ah, my God, was my own pale and lifeless face, looking at me with my mouth open in a silent scream. I was trying to loosen nothing, while eranged hands dragged me whole. The soil began to close upon me, grains falling on my face, my eyes, my mouth. I could not breathe, I could not scream, and so everything was dark. The silence was the first thing I noticed when I woke up. No sound of wind cutting the tombs, no leafy falling in the darkness, just an absolute void. My eyes were open, but all around me I tried to move my chest. Air was heavy, dense, suffocating solo. I was buried alive. My heart shot and started to debate. My nails scraped against the wood above me. It was a coffin. I knew this. I knew what was happening every second. I told a hoarse scream, but it was muffled by the weight of the ground above. I needed to get out my hands. Gone around looking for any crack. My fingers touched something frozen from me. But before I could react, I felt a movement beside me. The thing that was there breathed a thud. It echoed inside the coffin, followed by a slow scratch on the wood. The smell of rot filled my nose, so a call came from the weak darkness. Jonah the grave was ready. The deals that let out my throat. The lid of the coffin was not only dark, and there was no more light, and there was no more dark light. Endless emptiness swallowed by the hole that I had fallen myself to Jonah's body. The body of Ravenwood is still surrounded by mist, and for the silence of forgotten tombs, some say that in the darker dawn it is possible to hear the noise of a paddling alone. Others swore a figure wearing a faded blue uniform, wandering the names of people who have not yet been buried. If one day you visit a Saint Field at dawn and hear a call calling your name, may only be your imagination, or maybe it is Jonah opening a grave to you. And now tell me, you have already dug your own grave. If you enjoyed this story, leave your comment and tell you what was the most shivered. Do not forget to check out other stories of the channel. But be careful to listen to the whole story. Lois Tale. The dawn was very dark that week. I, a simple caretaker, knew what was coming, but never imagined that it would be so terrifying. The tombs were my companions, their shadows accompanying me as sentinels from beyond. But at dawn, something different, hovering. Something that made the wind whisper my name and the ground under my feet shake as if they were Berry Campo Santo. He begins to hear calls, to feel invisible presences, as if the dead never really if they were, but I was so proud of my coldness, of my ability to do the work without listening to the rumors. But at dawn, the silence was not common. He was about to learn that silence keeps more secrets than the voices of the dead. The saints always peace, or at least is what is said to the living. I, who worked there for more than 20 years, knew that reality was quite different. When the sun was, the dead seemed to awaken from their tombs, and the Saint Holy was a place where time made no sense, was a vastness of ancient tombs and tortuous trees whose branches extended like skeletal fingers. To the dark heave I rested. I was the only one there at dawn, as my work did not involve just burying the dead, but also keeping the place, ensuring that everything was in order. And with each dawn was like the field saint renewed with the first rays of light, touching the stones with softness that made the names recorded in them seem almost alive in that particular dawn. Something was wrong with the feeling, and restlessness wrapped me. The winds were stronger, and the trees shook with unusual violence. The full moon seemed to look straight at me, as if it was watched. Me was used to the mystery that the saintly carried, but something new was something that made me feel that this dawn would not be like the others. Passed through the stone corridors. Between the tumbles, my lantern is dumped through my steps. There was something that stopped me in place. A slight whisper, almost like a sigh. Fear did not dominate me immediately, but the feeling that something was watching me, something that was not there before, it made me shiver. I forced me to keep thinking that the wind could, but I could never stop hearing that whisper in the depths of the morning. Was like the soil itself was trying to alert me to what was about to happen, but called to find out over time. I saw myself even more dipped in a sense of discomfort. Something in the scent-scented field seemed different, but I could not understand what. The wind had ceased, but the air was still charged with something that could not identify. The shadows seemed to move between the tombs as if they were alive entities, and for a moment I could swim in the silence. I convinced me that it was just tiredness, or perhaps the reflection of the light of my flashlight on the wet stones creating illusions. But then the noise was unmistakable for another. I heard something like a little noise, something dragging on the ground. Sometimes it seemed like a scratch. I was so used to the silence of the field that any distant sound made me. For the old tomb of a man named Joaquim Sequeira, something caught my attention. There was moved as if someone had tried to turn the ground in some way. The instinct said to not investigate, but my curiosity spoke louder with the handy hand I always carried with me, and began to dig. A strange urgency. My hands sweated to every piece of soil. A metallic object that fear has definitely settled. I had already dug up several bodies over the years, but never something. The iron blade was completely covered by soil and moss, but its shape was unmistakable. A strange lock. Was as if someone had hidden something important with a thrust. I removed the key from my pocket and tried to open it, but to my surprise it did not come from the bottom. Solo was not just the lock that moved, was like something was moving under my feet, as if the soil around me was alive with my heart. I looked around. The feeling that it was being observed was palpable, but there was no one in sight. The weak wind beating on the leaves of the trees, and my own heavy breath by anxiety, but then a low, inaudible laugh. It was not something that should not exist, a laugh that should not exist, a laugh. He paced the soul, as if the dead were mocking my courage. Foolish, and I understood something. I was waiting for me there in that field. So much more time than I could imagine, and I had just asked the wrong question. The distorted laughter remained louder. Was as if something was approaching me, but the shadow that appeared between the tombs seemed if it really was my mind, or if it was moving in the darkness. The only thing I knew was that there was no way to go back. The weight of the soil, the lock, and the feeling that the whole field was alive pressed me suddenly. The lantern treated and deleted. The darkness took over. The noise of laughter ceased for a second, but the silence was even more terrifying. I could hear my own heavy breath. Seemed to me that was happening. There was when I heard the steps were not mine or anyone else. Were dragged heavy steps, as if an invisible presence were approaching. The ground seemed to open up below me. I looked to the floor, and to my surprise I saw something that I would never imagine from the bottom of the newly opened grave, and a repulsive bones slowly emerged as if it was reaching the surface. To pull me, it was not an ordinary corpse. Had no flesh, had no life. Was something that I could not understand. The figure rose more like a compacted soil being and bone fragments, a body that should not exist. His dark eyes as dawn shone for a moment before a horrible sound, like glass nails, took the environment. I could not do anything. My body frozen, and for the instant I could hear was unzipped from my heart, beating in desperation. The creature approached slowly, and when her eyes fixed on me, I realized that something even more horrible was about to happen. She was not there to kill me, not to show me something I should not have approached. Old, before my existence, before I could react. The figure extended her hand in my direction, and an invisible force pulled me into the tomb. I shouted, begging for help. No one would hear. The ground closed themselves around me, and the world fell on the darkness. Was when I realized the truth. The dead never rest. They are just waiting in silence. waiting for the time to wake up. And now, as everyone before me was part of something much greater, something the living could never understand, when I finally recovered the conscience, I was lying immersed in a dense darkness. The feeling of pressure on my body was overwhelming, as if the ground around me was squeezing myself, suffocating. I tried to move, but my arms and legs were heavy, as if the gravity had increased in an inexplicable way. I was inside a tomb. This was clear, but what I could not understand was how I had come there. The memories of the creature, of the sinister laughter, of the soil hand and bones that pulled my mind. But now, my mind was not. Everything was silent. There was no one else. The wind that once seemed almost alive was now absent, and the only thing left was my own panic. I tried to call for help, but my voice did not come out. The air was thick, as if it were impossible to breathe. There was nothing but the darkness, and the time had stopped, so that without warning, something moved in the darkness. In front of me was not the shadow. I moved between the tombs. Something I knew of me more than I would like to admit. The shadow passed without caring about my presence, as if I was invisible to her. But the moment she disappeared, the feeling of being observed, if she intensified, the fear dominated me, to force my body to move out of that tomb. But the more I struggled, the more I felt that the ground was not just the soil, was not just the ground, but a much darker force. The saint was somehow keeping me there, as if I were a prisoner in a place that I had known me for a long time. And then at the bottom of my mind, a called, whispered, "You will not come out." It was like the ground, the wind and the shadows were in perfect harmony, conspiring me to keep me in that darkness. I knew at some level that the only option was to accept my heart, but not avoided the heartfelt. Once again, and for a brief moment, the feeling of being alive took me. But soon, the weight of the ground, the silence and the darkness again swallow me. And it was at this moment that I realized that the saint never forgives. He just awaits. He awaits the next victim. And now I was bound to be part of his eternal vigil, condemned to witness what would happen to those who have dared to approach more than he keeps, the career who dare to invest. Silence of the Saint Silent becomes a legend, another whisper, lost in the nighttime breezes. But I have been a man now. I'm just a shadow between the tombs. My existence, marked by a fatal error, remains in the limbo between what is real and what should not be touched. If you someday walk between the tombs, if the dawn is dark and the wind whispering your name, remember the janitor who has not heard and heard, if he has heard too much. Something crawling behind you will be too late. If you liked this story, check out others here from the channel and comment what you think. Do not forget to subscribe to more mysteries that the living prefer to forget. Until you are brave enough, music, laughs, you have heard the noise of a shovel cutting the soil in the absolute silence of the morning. I hear every morning, no matter how heavy I do the weight. As for the weight of what I've seen here, to work as a janitor in New Orleans is to deal with the end. But sometimes this end is not enough. What happened to me in that rainy morning between anti-tombs, tastes and shadows that seemed to move on, willingly changed everything. I never slept in peace again. And after I tell you, maybe you don't sleep. My name, no matter what matters, is what I do and what I saw as a janitor in an old saint field of New Orleans, one of those that the city of Salem seems to have forgotten. The trees here are so old that their roots raise the tombs, and the foggish as the floor. A veil hiding secrets that no one should find is a place that breathes history pain, and something else that hides between the tombs and always watches the waiting. I come before the sun puts itself and only leaves when the darkness dominates. All people think my work is lonely, but I know the truth. I'm never alone here. There is always something or someone watching. The old campus, some cracked by time, seemed to be silent witnesses. Dawn, something was different from the beginning. The wind blowing colder, carrying the smell of damp soil and dead flowers. The Saint-Saint was deserted as always, but there was a strange silence, heavy, as if the place itself were holding my breath. And then, as I prepared a burial to a burial at dawn, here's a low sound, almost imperceptible. but impossible to ignore, as if someone dragged my feet in a few meters from where I was looking around and looked around, and the rows of ancient tombs saw a figure. Was still in front of a tomb that I knew very well. The strangest, I was sure that a few minutes before that place was empty, the figure before the tomb was not moved. The weak glow of the nearest pole illuminated only the thin contour with a rigid posture and hunted hands at the body. I could not see the face, and I felt a shiver in the spine. I knew well, that I knew well, that I knew well, that I knew the face. Tomb. The name recorded there was recently buried, that person, with my own. Hence a few days ago, and I knew no one had come to visit, and it's okay. My voice came out firmer than I expected, but there was no answer. Just the wind carrying the rustle of the dried leaves. I took a few steps, each echoing in the damp silence. The ground still cadded under my boots, but the noise was not the noise. It was no longer disappeared, as if it had dissolved in the air. A strange cold took over the more intense place than the dawn of New Orleans. So I heard something was not. Any noise was a whisper. Not a breath from the ground that the tomb swallowed could be gas. Might be the coffin with moisture happens. I had seen everything in this work, but this time it seemed to the noise, or someone was trying to. Getting the instinct shouted for me to leave, but my hand was already dug into the shovel, and I'm a caretaker. I open graves. I do not run from them. Sink the blade, cut the cute soil, a blow too, and then something hard. Not wood, did not stone, something metallic. Before I could process, the cell phone vibrated in my pocket, breaking the silence as thunder. I looked at the unknown number, digging in the wrong place. My heart shot. The echo of that voice still vibrated in my ear when the sign of the connection fell, leaving only the muffled noise of my own breath in the wrong place. What it wanted to say to the whole. The blade banging against that buried metallic object. I knelt, throwing the soil with something cold and dirty. Appeared an old box of iron. Echoing not distant behind me, I turned in a snap, and there she was, the closest figure, much closer to the weak light of the poster revealed her face, or rather her absence, was a black void, a blur without features, but with a suffocating presence. My body froze, but my hand lifted the tool with strength. But before you could do anything, she said, and the call was the same as one should not, disappeared. Shadow dissolved by the wind. The noise came back, but now under me, the ground that I dug began to give. In an impossible hole opened, and the floor simply swallowed me into the darkness. The fall was quick, but the brutal impact of my cell phone lit up the narrow and moist brick walls. I was in some kind of underground tunnel. A structure that did not appear in the holy maps had the pound's scratching marks, many scratches. A putrid smell invaded my nostrils. Something was there, something alive. I heard the heavy, slow drag, as if nails ripped the ground, so a decomposed pale hand emerged from the darkness and held my ankle with inhuman strength pulling. I shouted, kicking with all my strength, feeling the bones crackling under impact, but it did not let go of the reflex. Pointed the flashlight, and what I saw was impossible. The face was my rotten, distorted reflection, looking at me with empty eyes, but full of hatred. And then he said it should not be alive. The air disappeared from my pure terror, and I paralyzed me, and I fell to me, and the pure terror paralyzed me, deformed, kept the squeeze on my ankle. Her voice. My voice echoed in the distorted tunnel, as if time and death had corrupted you. You took my place. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't expect to find out. With a desperate kick, my foot, tearing skin and meat from that putrid hand, the creature dragged into my direction, but I ran into the narrow walls with the noise of the noise, claws scraping behind me. So a weak light, I ran toward her until my feet found a solid floor. The space opened, and I was under the saints' field. Was not an ordinary tunnel, was an old funeral chamber forgotten by time. The ceiling was sustained by cracked columns, and around dozens of niches covered with ancient tombs. But one of them was open on the ground, and I saw an inscription on the ground with letters here. Jazz, who was buried alive. A cold traveled my pimple, and then steps behind me, that rotten reflex, looked out of the darkness with eyes that seemed to burn in fury. You should not be here, because this place was yours. And so I understood I was not the janitor. I was the dead and forgotten in that place. And I escaped, but before I could react, my chest, not physically, but pulling something out of me, my vision darkened. I fell when my eyes opened. I was out of the Saint, the grey sky of New Orleans, the cold morning wind. I was alive. I got up, feeling the different, heavy body tired. I touched my face behind me, a fresh hole with a young tomb, my name with the date today, and I hear a scream of someone. Arrested, I was out, but who had left? So that's it, I left that place. But I am myself. Since that day, I don't sleep at peace. When I pass before mirrors, I feel that something watched me on the other side. And sometimes I hear a call that is mine, but coming from somewhere, stuck in a suffocated whisper, asking for help. And now you heard my story, so I ask you, assure who you really like this story, who also likes a creepy terror, and tells me here in the comments you have already felt that it was out of your own place. We see each other, or rather find yourself in another dark story. Until then, take good care of your shadow,